神様はどこ？知らない。
So, here we are.
Here we are, back again.
Wherever this may be.
Doing the same gag that we always do.
But
since we've got a green screen.
We're here for a reason. And we're here to talk about Memories, which recently came out, re-released by All the Anime Limited, restored in wonderful high definition, and it's been good to refresh my memory on this.
It has, yeah. Yeah, it's been a while since we watched it, and they did a good job with the restoration. It looks really nice on Blu-ray. It came with a nice little booklet and some features and things.
Yeah, it's a real nice set overall.
Yeah, and it's a great movie. It's Katsuhiro Otomo, isn't it?
Mm.
Best known for Akira, and a massive influence on a ton of early manga. He kind of kickstarted that realistic sort of style, that like dark manga style, and a lot of authors have cited him as like a direct influence. So he's a massive name in Japan and in the West. Akira was big in the West.
Yeah, Akira is a huge global hit, and I think it was kind of off the back of that he could just walk, get the, funds to do something like this. Anthologies aren't that common. There are a lot of OVA anthologies, particularly from a lot of people that worked on this film in particular. But anthology movie releases are kind of few and far between, so it makes it quite special amongst those kind of collection short stories.
Yeah, and it seemed like it was going to be something that was just a small sort of adaptation of some short stories that kind of got a bit bigger. Our understanding is that it got some overseas funding, and then it swelled in size, and it was sort of 3 years in the making, but what came out of it was quite impressive.
So going into the stories on offer here, Memories is a trilogy of short stories. So as we alluded to already, the first one of these is Magnetic Rose, and is where the title draws its name from, Memories. The second one is Stink Bomb, and the third one is Cannon Fodder.
Yeah,
so,
and to make it more confusing, we're going to talk about those in reverse order, because that's going to make it a bit easier to string things together.
It makes the sense. Magnetic Rose really is the centerpiece, and there's a lot to talk about there. So let's save that to the end. Give ourselves some time to talk about that a bit, to start from reverse to the front, and that
beginning with Cannon Fodder.
Cannon Fodder,
which was written and directed by Katsuhiro Otomo. This is his sort of one-man thing. He didn't bring any other extra directors onto this. And it's the shortest of the three, isn't it? Running at 20 minutes compared to 40 minutes for both of the other two.
So the first thing out the belt to notice is the entire short is filmed in one panning shot, basically. There are transitions, there are scene transitions, but it's all, the camera never hard cuts. It's moving throughout the whole scene from one scene to the next, following our characters as we go. Yeah,
which is something that would be much harder to do in a live action film, almost impossible. So it's this kind of thing that anime is really built for. These like really ambitious shots that wouldn't be feasible in sort of a standard mediums.
What a limitation to put on yourself as a director. I mean, like, just, it has been done in film, and it's no less arduous in animation to do these kind of long, continuous shots. If you think that this is still in the time period where we have cell animation, so there is some digital animation in this. It was kind of necessary, and some pioneering. So this is 1995, this came out. So kind of around the period of Jurassic Park, and kind of CG was kind of starting to come into its own, but it was kind of really early CG in anime, and particularly to get some of those shots where they're moving down corridors and the like, and trying to move around walls or down staircases, it was necessary that they would have to render some of the 2D images onto these three-dimensional planes.
Yeah, certainly at that time, doing that kind of 3D stuff, takes so long to render. If you then want to make a change to a scene or something, you're going to have to wait a week for that whole thing to come through, and there were a lot of pushback and changing things, is my understanding, and that's what kind of made it take so long to get the collection out.
So I think, let's actually talk about the narrative for a thing. Let's set the scene. So, Cannon Fodder, it follows a day in the life of a family in a city that seems to be filled with military and cannons. Everything seems to be completely militarized. So we mentioned the panning shots. I think it gives this kind of voyeuristic quality to it, a bit Hitchcock. And kind of from the child of the family waking up, having breakfast with the parents, camera follows from behind and just follows them throughout their day. You know, the child on the commute to school, the father going to work, the mother in the munitions factory. And in terms of like a plot and a narrative, there's nothing overt in there. It's very just, you're sitting, you're watching, and you're kind of soaking in what this world is, this city of cannons and armaments that they live in.
Yeah, war seems to be sort of everything to these people, doesn't it? It's their whole industry. It's how everyone's job and their school is all related to these cannons, and also it seems that all their culture is as well. The cartoons are just like cartoons of shooting at enemies and things like that. And I don't know if you notice, there's one shot, there's a bookcase, and the only book on the case that you can read just says gun. So like their entire culture is just revolves around this war with an enemy that may not even exist. We don't see the enemy. No. We don't see any retaliation from the enemy. It could just be that this is set up in order to give people jobs and a culture, rather than an actual necessity in order to defend against an enemy.
Even the room they eat in looks like the interior of, like, say, a World War II bomber plane. Everything is, there's great attention to detail in everything, kind of drawing from this industrial, militarized kind of society, rife with propaganda as well. All the walls are covered with this kind of like what we call acrylic text.
Cyrillic.
Yeah,
it gives the impression that it's kind of European, doesn't it? And he's gone for this style that isn't typical for anime. No. It looks much more like those like Franco-Belgian comics kind of style. It's like bande dessinée or something like that.
Bande dessinée.
Can't pronounce the French word, but that kind of European comic style is what he's going for. And you wonder if that's maybe a commentary on the kind of industries that Westerners tend to have revolving around war. Like maybe you work as like some kind of engineer that makes widgets for Raytheon or whatever, and like these arms businesses provide so much of the bolstering the economy and giving people jobs and things, and you wonder if he's kind of trying to explore that idea a bit in this.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, on the point of the European art style, I mean, like, again, I feel like he's challenging himself. He's not gone for his neither a conventional anime art style or even Otomo's own conventional iconic style. He's completely shrugged those and tried to do something original, not just in like how things are drafted, because rather than anime with these hard block cell colours, they've gone for like pencil line sketches. I understand that in the paints they used on the cells were, quite unique materials they wouldn't normally use. And it really gives it this fantastic visual effect. It looks very storybook-esque. It looks unlike most anime. But to the point you were talking about, the kind of being at the heart of the culture, that division of labour, I found it interesting that not everyone seemed to be in on it. You know, there was the scene in the munitions factory where everyone's cheering when the Cannon 17 launches, and they're all pumping their fists in the air, and there's one disgruntled woman just folding her arms and come on, and she kind of gets in on it. So,
well, the only protesting they allow is the people that are protesting things that are kind of inconsequential, like, oh, don't use toxic powder in the gunpowder machines. They allow that in the society, and that seems to be a kind of misdirection. Like, it seems like you're allowed to protest things, but actually you're just allowed to protest things that are completely inconsequential to the running of the military industrial complex. I was wondering about the final shot, because he goes to bed, doesn't he, the kid, and he falls asleep. And then you hear a siren and you can see blue light sort of seeping through the windows, and that kind of reminds me sort of like a police siren and like a police lights, implying that maybe there is some kind of resistance to this going on. It's not that this society is working for people necessarily. It's the people that are under the surface trying to rebel against it. It's not that everyone's all happy with this sort of state of affairs necessarily.
So I want to talk about the firing of Cannon 17. It's kind of the centerpiece. And for a moment, to start right at the start of the piece, the child wakes up and the first thing he sees is this military general in the painting. Kind of like he salutes it as he gets up in the morning.
It's like grand, huge painting of this noble-looking man, isn't it?
Yeah, and he kind of, whatever he says, oh, I want to be, I don't want to just be a cannon worker, I want to fire the cannon. So, the cannon in question is these huge, towering, everything has a cannon on it for a start, every building has a cannon. And there are just like hundreds of workers moving the cannon into position, getting the munitions, arming them, putting the powder in. It's a huge operation to fire one of these cannons. In fact, at the end of the episode, it talks about how, one shot fired from these cannons, like 4 shots were the most. It's like the most you can do in a day is 4 cannon shots. That's how arduous it is to load and operate these cannons. And it seemed to me like it was like ritual. You know, they're all following a ritual. It wasn't just work. It wasn't just labour.
Certainly, the cannons are as much about the culture of the people as it is about the industry of these people. There seems to be both elements of that to it, doesn't there?
Yeah, which is why I kind of thought about the fact that they can't imagine outside of it. This is so central to them. So referring back to that general figure, and this is really, I love this scene. The person that fires the cannon, this kind of officer, comes out in the uniform, and rather than this splendid, figure in his regal uniform, is this podgy, bumbling, kind of like really kind of quite gross-looking guy. He's like really in his uniform tight, trying not to poke out of it.
He's very exaggerated in his animation as well, isn't he? Things are jiggling, and you've got this kind of like bombastic sound, like soundtrack.
Oh
yeah. That kind of thing. But it's obviously meant to be this like huge kind of juxtaposition with what you see on the painting of him that's in presumably in everyone's houses.
Yeah, and the actual reality of this rather grotesque kind of like belly jiggling and kind of really pompous person that fires the cannon. There is the what is pitched by propaganda and the reality that is actually experienced and observed by people.
I do want to talk briefly something I found out about the number 17. Apparently, it's unlucky because the Roman numeral is like an you can rearrange the letters to be Vixi, which is like I have lived, i.e., I am now dead.
Right.
So you wonder if, like, because he's taken all this European influence, maybe he would go for the number 17 because it's uniquely a sort of Roman association with the number 17. So yeah, that's just a kind of interesting aside because you do see that the number 17 comes up again and again and again, doesn't it?
Yeah. So overall, it was a really interesting piece. I can't help but feel naturally, I think there's going to be some callback to, wartime Japan, which was very militarized, had a very military culture. I think inevitably there's going to be some kind of references to that and the like, but it's more than just that, of course. I think there are parallels. In this case it was military, but what kind of things do co-opt societies, these kind of like industry or technology that kind of become the centre of society completely throughout history and in our modern time. It's hard to say, but I think this kind of movie kind of gives you a view in a perspective of...
Yeah, kind of a hyperbolic exploration of kind of Western attitudes to industry and culture, isn't it? And yeah, it was a good piece. Certainly on a rewatch I appreciated it much more. Got a lot more from it. So yeah, it was a good one.
So, Stink Bomb. It's about a lab technician in a pharmaceutical company who, unwittingly, from his own bumbling incompetence, becomes a living bioweapon, which kills anyone in a kind of 100-meter radius behind him, and the more stressed he becomes, the more deadly he becomes. And on the orders of his superiors is ordered to take the secret documentation and samples to Tokyo, but this kicks into effect a whole cascade of terrible mistakes, which just end in first as tragedy, second as farce.
Yeah, it's a much more light-hearted piece, isn't it, compared to the other two in the collection, and it's almost like a comedy of errors, almost.
Yeah,
like he
that's what I was looking
continually makes these mistakes, and you just kind of want to say to him, like, come on, like, it's obvious that it's when you get close to someone, like, by the end it just gets ridiculous that he hasn't realised what's going on.
So it's a genuinely funny piece. It's not like a laugh a minute or like laugh out loud. It's just like genuinely kind of humorous. The way things escalate, it's constantly going up and up. Like the stakes are constantly rising. It really does try to establish itself in the normal. It's set in the kind of a rural town. There's these lovely shots of hills and valleys and just it's a lot lighter. Because something that's worth talking about is how visually different all the different pieces are. This is definitely the most Otomo, I would say, of the pieces.
Yeah, my understanding is the director is Tensai Okamura, and they originally wanted to get Yoshiaki Kawajiri, but it was just too different from his style, and he kind of said he would just assist Okamura on it. And he was asked to get something close to the Otomo style, I think, but he was just coming off the back of Yawara, a fashionable judo girl by Naoki Urasawa. And you can see some of Urasawa's art style kind of bleed in with the Otomo art style, and you get a kind of fusion of the two, don't you?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, because I guess in the shorthand, it looks the most like Akira, but I can definitely see Urasawa's influence as a mangaka in this piece. All the pieces have kind of an element of horror to them. And key to horror is setting up the normality. So, we're doing this in reverse order, but, Magnetic Rose is straight up horror, which is why I said, first is tragedy. And part two is kind of follows the tropes. It kind of has the setting up of normality, but it's as farce, because it just gets very farcical from that point onwards.
Yeah, it's something that you imagine if something like that did happen, it would be quite distressing, obviously, if you couldn't be close to anyone like that. Yeah, in terms of the science fiction element, you wonder how close that could be to the truth. It does seem like he's maybe done his research and he's maybe pulled out things that could potentially cause something like that.
So this is actually based on a true story, my understanding is.
Yeah, I've heard that there was some influence by some story potentially.
So there was a case in America, a patient called Gloria Ramirez. She was a cancer patient who was brought into an ER, and upon treating her, people noticed a strange fruity garlicky smell, and within kind of minutes of this, people in the ER started collapsing, fainting, and they had to evacuate the whole hospital, and they're not sure how this, a theory has been proposed on what might have happened. They suggest she was self-treating with some kind of pain medication.
Dimethyl sulfate, I have in my notes.
Yeah, that's the one. And when she had been defibrillated, the electric charge might have metatized it into a toxic substance that was secreted through her sweat. Apparently her body was covered in a oily sheen and the like. That's just a theory. Who knows? It makes a lot of sense, but it's interesting because I think the idea was that she was on so many medications. She was basically doing chemistry in her own bodies, and it's perhaps a poignant thing there to kind of consider, with how kind of medicated we are these days.
Yeah, it definitely seems to me that when Otomo was writing this, he was probably reading some medical journals and various science articles and things, and he'd probably pulled that case up. And also the other thing was it reminded me kind of pollen in the way that the gas behaves. And there's a little aside where flowers are blooming all over the city.
You're saying winter, it was flu season, so all the flowers should be deceased. So he's, humans are dying, but all the flowers start blooming.
And the other thing is it affects technology, doesn't it? Which you wouldn't get with just a smell. So it's almost like there's small particles in maybe a sort of a nature versus science kind of narrative, sort of somewhere under the surface there.
So an element of comedy built into the actual mechanics of this infection he has. They state quite early on that it seems to be secreted through his sweat. And so therefore, the more he's riding on this little bicycle trying to get to Tokyo from the villages, the more he's sweating, the more stressed he becomes, the more panicky, the more toxic he becomes. And of course, the government's response to learning that there is a walking bioweapon on their way to Tokyo is kill him. So it doesn't go so well.
Yeah, I think that's part of what Otomo is really exploring as well, is the how he felt that the Japanese government or the governments of the world would respond to this kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, there's something to be said, what is a government? What is the power of government? Really, what a government is they have the legal use of force against their citizens. That's what a law is, if you break the law, you will be forcibly restrained and the like. And the military, which is centre stage in this story, is the ultimate arbiter of force. And when you have a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. And so you're going to try and use that to solve every problem. And, that's what they try to do against this guy. It starts with sniper rifles, but it quickly escalates from there.
Yeah, the stink gas seems to have a sort of an effect on this technology, and he manages to comedically dodge the entire assault from the world's military, doesn't he? So
I think an interesting bit is the tunnels seem quite important. So he always comes to tunnels as he's on his way to Tokyo. And it seems to me that every time he passes a threshold of tunnel, things significantly escalate. So the first tunnel, he kind of that's when he kind of clocks that he's the one that's toxic, this gas is following him and everyone starts running away from him. And then I love it. And then he gets the pop shots with the snipers when his grandmother's in a helicopter telling him to stop. And he comes out in this second tunnel and the sky is just filled with helicopters and jets and it all goes nuts. So I think that's probably a point to start talking about the mecha love in this episode.
Yeah, Otomo is big on his mechanical designs, isn't it? And you get a lot of nice shots from that. Even the characters are kind of simply designed. You get a lot of very detailed mechanical animation in 2D as well, for the most part, which tends to be quite hard to do. It's sort of a directorial debut for Tensai Okamura, isn't it? Because he was previously doing some keys on Yawara, a fashionable judo girl, and this is where he kind of got his start. It was recommended by Kawajiri, is my understanding.
Yeah, he's most well known for Darker Than Black. He was the director writer on that, so he's probably his most significant kind of well-known
potentially
work.
Wolf's Rain, which was shown in the West and was quite popular. He was the director on that as well.
He just he's worked on a lot of stuff. So, I was watching this and I was seeing tanks all lined up on a row and that military control room with the hustle and bustle and all the screens and the people at the desk and the drums and the music. Couldn't help but think of Evangelion. Lo and behold, he's an episode director and keyframe animator on Evangelion, End of Evangelion, which was made in the same year. I don't think that's coincidental, so I think you can definitely see his fingerprints in Evangelion, totally.
Yeah, and I did some work on Ghost in the Shell as well, is my understanding, so there's probably a lot that sort of carried over to his next projects.
One of the probably underrated, animators.
Yeah, he's not the name on the front or anything, but he's had a hand in a ton of massive projects, hasn't he?
So, in terms of where we go with this, it transpires that the Americans, of all people, were funding the research into this pharmaceutical. So they're a little reluctant to kind of just let this go. They don't want him killed. They would like to kind of get the knowledge and the information from the research they funded. They tried to tackle it, the Japanese military, but they kind of have to, the Americans have a seat at the table, you know. It was kind of interesting. And of course, this was preventative. They weren't trying to create a bioweapon, they were creating countermeasures to potential bioweapons, in which you need to create bioweapons to counteract them. Just to counteract them, of course.
This is a thing that happens.
This would never happen in real life. This is anime. But I digress. That was kind of an interesting bit, because when the Japanese government of all given hope is at the foot of Tokyo, is about to enter the major metropolis area, the UN are on their way to just glass the city, basically. And the Americans come in with their high-tech NASA suits, and I wondered for the longest time where I thought the astronaut on the front cover was from, like, Magnetic Rose, but actually it's the biosuit from Stink Bomb.
Yeah, the spacesuit type thing seems to be something that Otomo's quite fond of, isn't he? Because there's another short that was supposed to be in this compilation but ended up being done later for Short Piece, which was A Farewell to Weapons. And that has a lot of focus on these sort of mechanical suits, these sort of spacesuit things, and this seems to be something that Otomo's really interested in.
The whole thing is absurd. It seems to me the reason this could happen at all is because of the secretness of the research. Like, everything's compartmentalized, and this kind of lower level kind of bureaucrat, just lab technician, stumbled across it. And because he's never told the whole picture, like, how is he to know any better? And so you've got, like, the top down, all the research is, you know, funded by the American government, and the command and control center is getting all this intel and information to them. You know, it looks very professional and slick. But on the ground, you know, these are human beings in the lab. They're co-workers, you know, they have flaws, they have merits, you know, things aren't filed correctly, things are left out, like, things aren't communicated properly. And, you know, like I said, because of the secretness of the research, that's not, it's intentionally not communicated to them. I found this interesting kind of, like, parallel between, like, how things are perceived at the top and how things are actually executed on the ground, and this complete miscommunication between the two is what results in just all the blunders that escalate.
Yeah, it was an interesting piece. It was a good showing from newbie Tensai Okamura. A good addition to the compilation.
I think it really kind of, it helps balance the tone.
Yeah, it refreshes you between the two more dark and serious shorts.
And it's not one people talk about, but it's definitely one should people pay attention to, and I would suggest more poignant than ever before.
Yeah, Magnetic Rose is certainly the centerpiece, but I wouldn't recommend skipping the other two or anything like that. They're definitely worth the look. Okay, we are back to talk about Magnetic Rose, the namesake and centerpiece of the Memories omnibus.
To the main event. But yeah, it's the first episode of the trilogy.
It's a strong opener.
Real strong. Starts off very strong. So, Magnetic Rose is a story about a crew of space salvagers. They receive a distress call from a rather turbulent area of space. In going into this debris field, they find this graveyard of ships and this strange structure in the middle. Seems to be shaped like a rose. And once they enter on board, everything is not as it seems, and a classic ghost story starts to unfold. So I really enjoyed this one. This is a real fantastic piece.
It's directed by Koji Morimoto and written by Satoshi Kon. Satoshi Kon is a big name that everyone's going to know.
Yeah.
Paprika and Perfect Blue, and you definitely see shades of that in this. Koji Morimoto, his name is probably less well known, but he's done a lot of striking animation work. He worked on Cobra, and did some work on Akira with Otomo, and that's how they kind of know each other. And he did the opening to Dirty Pair Project Eden movie, which is one of the best anime openings ever. So.
Definitely get those kind of like James Bond themes from it. Made me think of View to a Kill opening. It's a really fantastic, but the effects, the colour, if you've not checked that out, definitely check that out. But that's a great opening.
Yeah, and the combination of that strong visual style with Satoshi Kon's writing, it's no wonder this is the strongest of the three, really.
Yeah, because the Satoshi Kon influence, because when I read that he was the writer, I was like, oh, damn, that makes a lot of sense. But how much influence does the writer have? But my understanding is they were quite collaborative in this, and this is definitely one of Satoshi Kon's, like, his next big move after this was Perfect Blue. So this is kind of one of his first kind of debuts in that response. But I understand he did add quite a lot to the draft. There was a lot of revisions back and forth, and the original Her Memories, which was the short manga story by Otomo, about a third of it stayed in. I mean, they added quite a lot. They developed a lot of the characters, and it really brings it into its own. It's really quite... But also, worth mentioning, Yoko Kanno worked on this.
Yeah, it's really a trio effort, because her music work on this really sets the scene.
Yeah, like a lot of it taken from classic opera, primarily Madame Butterfly. Really kind of sets the tone, the grandioseness.
Grandiosity.
The grandiosity of the kind of setting we're in, particularly the opera theme that we will come across later.
It's an unusual kind of arrangement of Madame Butterfly, isn't it? Which Yoko Kanno is so good at. She tends to work best when she's rearranging things and sampling things and twisting things.
Yeah, they haven't just taken the score and just slotted it in. They've actually changed kind of how it's, for the scenes, it's quite aggressive in places. It's really loud. They've not just like, just take a cut of Madame Butterfly and slot it in. The way they've actually chosen to kind of perform it and the like really is specifically for that. So like a lot of it clearly thought has gone into the music, and was some of the staff on here that would, so from the last Stink Bomb, the director of Stink Bomb works on Cowboy Bebop as well.
Yeah.
Along with Yoko Kanno's most famous kind of musical piece. Mm-hmm. There's a lot, and there's clearly this. I think what Memories represents is a moment in time in the anime industry where a lot of like talent was really starting to come to the forefront.
I think that's a kind of advantage you can get from doing these kind of small productions, because you can then have three teams that can work on something small rather than a massive team trying to make an hour-and-a-half movie or something. You can iterate more and experiment more, and it tends to be worth doing.
Magnetic Rose is at heart. It's a horror story. It's a ghost story. It starts in the same way as you would expect these things to start. It kind of sets the sense of normality, which is kind of challenging to do in a science fiction show, but it works quite well.
It maintains the mystery throughout, doesn't it? Because it sort of does turn out at the end that it seems to be the effect of a sort of rogue computer potentially, but the whole way through you have this mystery hanging over you of, is it this fantasy thing where this ghost of this woman is haunting this ship? So that really keeps you engaged, because you want to know the answer to that, and you want to know why things are happening like that.
But like, I love how it starts off on this spaceship though, and they're just doing their kind of day-to-day job of salvaging and destroying kind of like random debris that's in the way and could cause a problem for commutes and stuff. And the way they established gravity, I thought was fantastic. You know, you're on the ship and everyone's at kind of different angles and they're sitting in different ways. They're floating in 0G.
The animation really sells it with the gravity stuff. There's a lot of movement that shows that they've kind of studied how movement in 0G would look, even with the liquids and the forces involved, hair movements and body movements.
Yeah, and everything's like really well realised. You kind of get vibes of like, kind of help to think of the Nostromo's from Alien. Kind of got that vibe. Planetes I couldn't help but think of as well. You know, these kind of, because they're junkers basically, and everything's like, you know, these spaceships are kind of, they're not glamorous, they're kind of just functional. They get onto the kind of satellite with this graveyard of wreckage and these ships, and when they actually get on board the ship, they're presented with this like grand mansion, this kind of almost Baroque kind of vibe, very grandiose and elaborate and lavish, and so different from all the kind of mechanics and kind of industrial kind of stuff that came before it.
Yeah, you have that striking juxtaposition of the industrial and the kind of classical, don't you?
I think what's interesting to talk about, masculine and the feminine elements. It's worth talking about an aspect of that. So the ship they're travelling to, or this kind of station, is shaped like a rose. It's like a rose petals in bloom, which is classic iconography of the feminine, you know, with the rose with its thorns. And our kind of antagonist of the piece is Eva, who is this famous opera singer. Basically, this kind of station is almost like you know, a monument to her, a trophy room, but also a kind of mausoleum. You know, because she is long deceased at this point. And so it is, you know, very much a place of the feminine. I can't help but think of like sirens, kind of, because when they get the SOS signal, they're hearing Madame Butterfly singing, you know, drawing the crew to this place. So, you know, there's some classic feminine archetypes there. But also of the crew that go over there, I think is quite interesting. So our two kind of protagonists for this are Miguel, kind of womanizing, kind of just like he's just kind of goes with the flow. You know, he's not too kind of focused, but he's certainly got a soft spot for the ladies. And Hines, who's a bit more of a down-to-earth, stoic family man, who they reference his family back home and his daughter and the like. And so these two men are venturing into this den of the feminine.
Yeah, both the guys have these kind of sort of psychological twists around women, don't they? And that plays into Eve as well. She obviously seems to have this relationship with her lover Carlo that is mirroring the characters in Tosca, which is what Madame Butterfly comes from.
Okay.
It's my understanding that scene where she stabs him in the fantasy is a scene from that opera, and that's kind of a mirror of her relationship with Carlo, and it's kind of implied that she killed him so that they could be together forever, is my understanding.
So I guess she's kind of retired to space to create this kind of like fancy world for herself. There's AI kind of robot servants and holograms, and it seems that she's kind of just created this monument to herself and this kind of monument to Carlos and her love for kind of what was lost, which is...
And it seems to me that the computer perpetuating this simulation long after her death has gotten to this point where it's going sort of beyond its programming to provide this fantasy even while she's gone, and that's what's creating this sort of bizarre, sort of haunted ship environment. It's kind of a compounding of errors which you get if you're running a program for a really, really long time. Something that's like just a small floating point difference can accumulate over hundreds of years, and then it can create this thing that's like wildly different to what the programming was intended to do.
But at the same time, like, that's never explicitly stated, and it really keeps the door open to this kind of ethereal quality, like a grudge, haunting. It's a classic kind of ghost story is kind of about the unresolved grudge or the emotional sentiment so strong it binds a soul to the kind of mortal realm. And whether literally or kind of metaphorically, that's kind of what we're seeing here, whether literally through a kind of spirit possession or kind of analog through the AI. It's basically what's happening here.
Yeah, and the main character is Heinz, and he has his own sort of story as well, and both of those blend in a way that keeps the narrative interesting. You get that A story and B story kind of intertwined, but it turns out that he's got some elements of his past that he's not upfront about, and he seems to, even to himself, to have buried all this stuff pretty deep down, doesn't he?
Yeah, so the kind of AI or the ship seems to be able to tap into people's memories. So you're seeing and experiencing, like in these glimpses, the memories of Eva, but you also start to seeing glimpse memories of Heinz. And it's, you keep seeing this little girl running around in the ship in the corner of his eye, leading him deeper and deeper in. And it's revealed later on that his dear daughter, in fact, has already died, falling from the roof of their home, which maybe explains why he's kind of exiled to space of kinds.
Yeah, one thing that I only noticed on this this second watch, was that a lot of the stuff with Heinz and his daughter is quite strongly foreshadowed. There's one scene early on where he's walking down a corridor and there's sort of a doll that drops from the ceiling, comes down. Later on they go into a room and there's the sort of a doll on like a music box that's revolving. He knocks that and it cracks on the floor. So it's all these things about these little girls falling and breaking, and that kind of, it's something that you maybe wouldn't pick up on until a second watch, but it's foreshadowing like his sort of past as well, isn't it?
So we talked about Heinz. Now, the other character, Miguel, he doesn't kind of get as much kind of dialogue or exploration, but I think there's still interesting stuff there. In particular, I think of like a really interesting scene where they split up. They're running out of time. They only had 3 hours on this ship to try and find the source of the SOS. And kind of get this feeling that Miguel is taking a kind of a descent into hell. Kind of as he descends, things become more decrepit, more, ruined and disorganized. And there's like almost like blood on the floor and slick oil. And he's kind of like going deeper and deeper into the bowels of this ship. And, as he does, he finds himself kind of increasingly seduced by the spirit of Eva. Miguel falls completely into this delusion. He wants to be the Carlos for Eva and relive her memories. And it's kind of like, there's some real imagery to behold there, because as he's kind of like captivated in this delusion, he's kind of like dancing in filth and, putrid oil and like, so I feel like there's some kind of imagery there about what it means to kind of wallow in your memories in the past.
Yeah, ultimately Miguel wasn't able to get past and overcome his complexes, was he? Whereas Heinz was able to kind of break out of illusion and kind of understand what was going on.
My feeling is that Miguel was not tethered to anything. He had no kind of, he never stuck to one woman. He never stayed in one place for long. He was always moving from one thing to the next, following his fleets of fancy. Heinz, although he'd lost his daughter, he had that family, he had that connection. He had kind of tried to, build a home and the like, and it seemed that is what ultimately tethered him to reality. No matter what kind of fiction Eva tried to wrap him up in, even though she offered him his, a life with his daughter, that reality of what he had lost is what tethered him to reality. And he was able to kind of come back. He was able to step away. But Miguel, who had made no such kind of attachments, was inevitably lost in the delusion.
思い出は逃げ込む場所じゃない。
So, any final thoughts on Magnetic Rose?
It was definitely the strongest of the trilogy. You know, you can really see the influence of Satoshi Kon in this. You know, those dream sequences, the blending of reality and fiction, which was so ideal for kind of like the ghost setting. Visually stunning. The soundtrack, the music is powerful and well used. And I really enjoyed it. I'm a really sucker for sci-fi as well, and all the attention to detail on all the mecha units and the internal logic and consistency. I really enjoyed. So, I mean, it's a great kind of it's accessible. I think a problem with a lot of anime is that it's often seeped in its own tropes, which people can find alienating. But this is very cinematic. It's a nice smorgasbord of what anime can offer. Every bit's individually different, so yeah, I really enjoyed Magnetic Rose and all the pieces in Memories.
Yeah, with the Magnetic Rose, they went for a more sort of realistic style, and maybe that's why it's kind of people see it as being more accessible. I think the blending of the two narratives is part of what keeps it so interesting. You're learning things about Eva and you're learning things about Heinz, and you've got this mystery that's slowly unfolding. And I think that's probably partially why people see that as the strongest one.
It's really a kind of piece of its time, I definitely think, as well. But that's not to say it's dated or anything. I think it's got some fantastic sensibilities, and it's definitely something worth revisiting and looking back on.
Yeah, definitely a collection I would recommend, and the all the anime Blu-ray is a great restoration. It's a good way to get at it now. It's available to purchase still.
Yeah, it's really accessible. I think anyone can enjoy it. This isn't just good anime, it's a good collection of movies. And I think it's for anyone to enjoy, really. Offers a bit of something for everyone. I guarantee that anyone will like one of the shorts. So, yeah, Memories. Really enjoyed it.